Hello and welcome back to this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to be discussing about how the front end communicates with the back end. So we are going to use WhatsApp for instance. So let's assume we have the front end of our WhatsApp. We all use WhatsApp or some other messaging platform. So we know how it works. And we discussed about front end development. So we know that front end has to do with development of the interface, right? What we can see. So let's create a very simple example of a DM, right? So this is a DM of Frank, that is our messages between us and Frank, right? So Frank has sent us some messages and we have also sent Frank some messages. So now we want to send Frank a new message, which is going to be message is going to be very simple and it's going to be A. So the message is simple and it is A, like that. So we want to send Frank a message, or I want to send Frank a message and the message is A. So we already know that the front end is the interface, right? What we see. But how does this message get to Frank? Now, that is the biggest question, and that's what we're going to be discussing in this lecture. Like we've said before, the front end is also called the client side. So, who is the client? The client is us, right? We are the client. So, the client is us. So, we are the client. We want to send a message to another client, right? Because Frank is also a client and we are also a client. So what happens behind the scene is that this message is converted into a format which we call the JSON format. So JSON is an acronym for JavaScript Object Notation. JavaScript Object Notation. So yeah, that's what JSON is. Do you understand? So and the way JSON looks is like this. So JSON looks just like this. So we know that the data will be converted to JSON format, right? The message which we want to send will be converted to JSON format. So now that we know that it's going to be converted to JSON format, and we know that JSON means JavaScript object notation. So I want to show us an example of a JSON data. So this is what the JSON data looks like. It's always like this in a coily braces like this. So we're just trying to show you an example now. So it always has a key. It always has a key and a value. So when we talk about key and value, it's just like in our dictionary, a real life dictionary. You know, in a real life dictionary, you would have a word, right? Then would have the meaning of that word. So that's exactly how JSON works. So there's always a key and there's always a value. A key is like a unique identifier, right? While the value is the value of that unique identifier. For instance, if we have a key, which is age, right? So age can be 18, you understand? So this is how JSON looks like. With JSON, we can pass data or send data from the front end to the back end. So the most important thing is that the message itself gets converted to JSON format and the JSON data is going to get sent to the backend. So this is just an example of what JSON looks like. But now let's see exactly what the data is going to get converted into. So this is what we are going to have at the end of the day. Something very close to this. We are just improvising. So the first and most important thing is the message. So the message itself now, so this MSG is the message, right? So it's a key. And the message itself is what? The message itself is A. Do you understand? A is the message. So what else or what other information will be sent to the backend? So first important one is the message and the next one will be the time. So you realize that when we send message, there's always a time down here. So that time is also important for tracking and some other things. You understand? So let's say the message was sent 1:20 a.m. So now that's going to be sent alongside. Do you understand? Just like I've said that JSON is has to do with keys and values. So message here is the key, and the value here is A. Time here is another key, and the value here is going to be the time that the message was sent. So here is 1:20 a.m., right? So another comma. Then the next thing is going to be like status. So status has to do with um like when you send a message, the status will be in sent. When the person receives it, it will be in received. When the person reads it, it will be in read. Do you get? So that's the status. So to begin with, the status is going to be in sent. That is, we've successfully sent this message. And another important point which I feel like you should have is to. To means that who are we sending this message to? We are sending this message to Frank. And another one is from. So we are sending this from who is the sender of this message? The sender of this message is Philip, which is me, right? So that's it. So we have a curly braces in the beginning, then at the end we have another closing braces. So now this is our JSON data. We have the message, we have the time, you have the status, we have the to, we have the from. This to is what receiver of the message, and from is the sender, which is me. So now we can see that this is not beautiful, right? What we can see is kind of scanty. It looks tedious. It looks unfriendly compared to what you can see here. What you can see here is looking nice. You just have a text message which is A, but behind the scenes, the A gets converted to JSON format, and I've explained what JSON format looks like here, and it gets converted to this kind of format, and this is what gets sent to the backend for further processing. So, to the big question, how do we now send this JSON data to the backend? Now, we ask the big question: how do we send data to backend? How do we send data to backend? So, traditionally, when we want to send something from one point to another, there's always a messenger, right? There's always a messenger, or there's always something that is going to carry the message from the point A to the point B. So for development, or in terms of web, the way the web works, for communication between point A and point B, we use what we call an API. Do you understand? We want to transport the JSON data, right? We want to transport the JSON data. But how do we transport it? That's the question here. We know that, okay, we have this data, we have this message, we have this time, you have this status, we have this data, right? But now we want to send it from the front end to the back end. So how do we send it? That's when we talk about API. So API is also another acronym for application programming interface. So this allows us to send message from the front end to the back end. So now, the reason for this line is to show the difference between the front end and the back end. But what connects the two is the API, right? So that's what connects the two. So we know that the API is what we are going to use to send data from the front end to the back end. So what exactly is an API? As we've said, API is an acronym for Application Programming Interface, right? So what application programming interface does is that it provides us with an interface that is, like, we are going to think of it as an entry point. Entry point. Do you understand? So now we know we have this data. We have this data, right? But we want to send it to the backend. So the backend is right here. So the backend is right here, and we have this data. So the API itself is the entry point to the backend. So when we send the JSON data from the backend, when we send the JSON from the backend, it goes through this entry point, and it comes back to the backend. You understand? So now the API is connector, which is what we call the application programming interface. So the application programming interface always looks like this. It's always developed by a backend developer. We discussed about what a front-end developer do, which is basically they develop the interface. And don't forget, now that we are talking about sending data to the backend, the front-end developer is also in charge of sending all of this data. They are the one that will convert the data to JSON format and then send it through an API to the backend. You understand? So now that we know that, let's proceed. So now what does an API look like? An API is always developed by a backend developer, right? So it's always a URL. You understand? So there's something we call an API endpoint. API endpoint. So let's think about something real quick. To better understand the way API endpoint works, we would use WhatsApp for example in this case. So this would help us understand what API endpoint really is and how it works and how it helps us connect the front end of an application to the back end, right? How we can pass data from the front end to the back end. So let's use WhatsApp for instance. So we have WhatsApp here. We have WhatsApp, right? We all know how WhatsApp works. So we have WhatsApp. WhatsApp has like, let's say, three major parts, right? We have personal DMs, like we have personal DMs. We have group, like group chat, right? We have groups. We have status. You understand? We have status. So what this is to tell us is that, do you know that when you want to do anything that has to do with the status, right? You would go to the status side and you upload the status. So if you want to view someone's status, you can view their status and all of that. So if you want to text in a group, there's always rules in that group. There's rules that is, at times there are some groups that you are in the group but you can't send messages. That because of you are not an admin and so on and so forth. So in terms of DM too, each person's DM is unique and it is different, right? Some people's DM, they don't have a DP. They don't have DP. Some have DP and some doesn't have. Some people, you can see their online status, whether they are online or not. Do you understand? So each person's DM is unique, right? So the way API endpoint works is that just the same way we have DM, we have status, we have groups. There are three different things that we can do or three different parts of the entire application. So that is the exact same way API endpoint works. So API endpoint helps us to route. When we say route, route is like a path. So when we say route, route is like a path, right? So if you want to go from a particular country to another country, right? There's always a way, there's always a route to go through. Do you understand? Let's say we have point A and we have point B, right? If I want to move from point A to point B, I would have to move like this in this direction. I would have to move south, right? I'll come downwards to point B. If I want to move from point B to point A, I would have to go north, right? So this is like the route. So that's exactly what API endpoint is. So API endpoint is like a route for us to manipulate or to interact with the backend. So earlier on, we wanted to send a message. Hey, I want to send a message A to Frank, right? So that's the reason why we're learning about API endpoints. So now there must have been some API endpoints created by the backend developer. You understand? So just like we can see here that we have DMs, we have DM, we have group, we have status, right? So that's the exact same way we would have different endpoints for each of those things. Do you understand? So for instance, if you want to upload something on your status, the backend developer must have created an endpoint that would look something like this. So we are just kind of improvising here. So this is not the exact same endpoint for WhatsApp. So we're just trying to work around what we can have here. So we should have something like WhatsApp. Don't forget that we are just improvising. This is not the correct endpoint. You understand? So we should have something like whatsapp.com slash send slash maybe MSG. So now This is what we refer to as an endpoint. So for sending messages, this is the endpoint that we would interact with. So when we say something is an endpoint, it is a road, it is a roadmap, or it's a path, or it's a route. So when you say something is an API endpoint, it is the way or it is the route at which we interact with a particular thing. So let's say, Philip is the person sending this message, right? Philip is the person sending this message A. We all know that, right? From this previous lecture, from this previous slide, you can see that Philip is the person sending the message. It is Philip sending the message, right? So when we look at it here, Philip is the sender and Frank is the receiver. So we know Philip is the sender and Frank is the receiver, right? So when Philip wants to send a message to Frank, on behalf of Philip, the front end would send a request. So we call it a request. Just like, okay, yes, I would like to send a message to Frank, right? So on behalf of Philip, because Philip is not a programmer, so he cannot do all of this coding, right? On behalf of Philip, the front end will send a request to this API endpoint. Once the request has been sent to this API endpoint, depending on if the data sent is okay or not, then this endpoint would return a response. So for every request, there's always a response. So the response would either be successful or it will be an error. You understand? So this is just for sending message. That's why we have to send it to whatsapp.com/send/message. So let's say it has to do with status upload now. Let's say Philip wants to upload a status, right? There will be a data, right? Everything we're doing is all about sending data. So instead of that data that we've seen in the previous lecture, there will be another form of data, right? Maybe that will contain the photo that Philip wants to upload or the video or whatever that Philip wants to upload, right? So there will be a photo or video or maybe, a text that Philip wants to upload. That will be the main contents of this data, right? So instead of going through, now that we want to upload the status, right, we are not going to send the uh, data to this endpoint any longer because this endpoint is for what? Is for sending messages. So we are going to now send to another endpoint, which is probably going to be like, so the endpoint is probably going to be like whatsapp.com/status slash upload or something like this, something close to this, right? So it's going to be like this. So sorry for the handwriting, right? So it's going to be like whatsapp.com/status/upload. So whatsapp.com/status/upload is one endpoint, while this one is another endpoint. So depending on what you want to do, that's what's going to determine the endpoint you are going to send your data to. So endpoint is always for specific reasons, right? So if you want to maybe remove your DP or you want to delete your DP, then you're going to be making another kind of request. Everything is a request, right? So you're going to make another type of request to another endpoint entirely. Do you understand? So who is responsible for creating these endpoints? So the people responsible or the person responsible for creating this endpoint is the backend developer. We are going to get to that later. So now we know that this data coming from Philip, right, that has been converted to JSON by the front end is going to go through a particular endpoint, which we've seen here. Do you understand? So when it goes through this endpoint, it's going to get a response from the backend. So the response can be either a successful response. So the response can be a successful one, which is going to be like 200, and it can be a bad one, maybe like 400 or the likes. So 200 in programming is, or in web generally, is a status code. So when we say something is a status code, just like we know status is like the state of something. So whenever we get anything that is within 200 and anything that has 200, right? Maybe 201, 202, 204, it simply means success, right? At times, it's success basically. It simply means success. So when you get anything 200, that's success for you. So when you get something like 400, 404, that's like a bad response or a bad something is going wrong somewhere. You understand? So now we have learned about API endpoint. That is, it is a route for passing data from the front end to the back end, right? And we know that whenever we make a request, we can either get success or failure, right? We now understand that data moves from the front end to the back end through an API endpoint. Like if you send data to the wrong endpoint, it will not work. That is, maybe you want to upload a profile picture or you want to upload the status. You now go ahead and send your data to this send message endpoint. It will not work. It's just like I want to go to Lagos, but I went to board a bus to Kaduna, which is another state in Nigeria. So that means that I'm going to land in Kaduna, and at the end of the day, I will not be able to achieve the purpose of that travel because I want to go to Lagos. Now I'm in Kaduna. That means everything is not going to work out well for me, right? So I have to make sure to go back to Lagos. So that's how it works. So, but we have something again called API verbs. We have something called API bits. So we have something called API verb. This one is very important and it's something you must know, right? So API verbs. So it can be called API verbs and it can be called API methods, right? Any of this is correct. You can call it API verbs or you can call it API method. So what exactly is API verb and or API method? So we have about 4 or 5 of them. There are actually more than 4 or 5. I think there are about 6, but we're just going to be mentioning about the 4 or 5 most important ones. So the first one and the most important or the most popular one is get. Then we have post. Then we have put. Then we have patch. We have delete. So these are like the 5 most popular ones. So what does this mean now? What is an API verb? We've mentioned API. We've mentioned what an API is. We've also mentioned API endpoints, right? So everything works all together. So now let me explain what it means. You know that when I said when we want to send a message to Frank, we have to go through a route that looks just like this. We have to send that JSON data to this route. Do you understand? Just like, okay, I want to send message to Frank, just like a post office. So I have to go through this route, right? So I make a request to this route. But now, what type of request do I make? Because there are different types of requests. That's when API verbs comes in. So API verbs now says that okay, you are here, you want to send a message to Frank, right? So to send a message to Frank, that must be a post request. What is a post request? Just like post office, postman. Post means sending something or sending data. That's what it means. When you say, I want to post the data, it means sending data. When we say get means get is just get, right? Get is like retrieving. Yeah. Best word to use for get is, post is sending, right? But get is retrieving data. And when we talk about put is updating, actually. It's updating existing data. Do you understand? So when you have a bio on your Instagram and you want to like update my bio, I want to put something in there. They are performing an update operation, and we have patch. Patch is also for updating. It is slightly different from put, but I'm not going to go into the details of what that does. And finally, we have delete. You have delete. So delete is for removing. So if you want to remove something completely, you use delete. So sorry for this wobbly handwriting. So for removing, you use delete. For put is for updating or editing. Post is for sending. Get is for retrieving. And patch is also for updating, but it's slightly different from put. So these are like the API verbs or methods that we have. So when we are sending data to a server or to the backend, we are going to use post request. Do you understand? So when we are trying to retrieve some information, let's say I want to know my current balance, maybe in a banking application, or I want to know my DVN or whatever, you are trying to retrieve data. So that's get request. When you are trying to edit, maybe you've sent a message on WhatsApp and you want to quickly edit it, that's editing or that's updating. So that's patch or put. Either of the two, they work similarly, but there's a little difference between them. And finally, we have delete. Let's say people that delete their profile pictures, people that delete their tweets, people that delete stuff. So if you want to delete a message, you are going to go you are going to make a delete request. So that's what it simply means. So when we are trying to send a message here, we are going to make what type of request here? We are going to make a post request. Do you understand? When we are trying to upload a status on our WhatsApp status, we are also making a post request. Do you understand? When we are viewing other people's status, that is status that some other guys, our friends, has posted, what kind of request do you think we are making at this point? We are making a get request because our friends have made those posts, right? So we are now retrieving it and we are viewing those posts. So we are making a get request. So we are making a get request here. So when they decide to delete their status, they are making a delete request. When we decide to delete our own uh status too, we're also making a delete request. Do you understand? So that's how it all works. So now we know that it is with the help of an API and an API endpoint and several API verbs. That's how we send data from the backend. That's how we send data from the front end to the backend. Do you understand? In the next lecture, we are going to discuss about what happens on the back end. See you in the next lecture. Bye.